Hey, good morning. This is Chris Meyer. I'm a family law attorney in the Houston area. I'm going on my morning walk to clear my head. I wanted to talk about a news article I read uh, recently. It was about intimate partner violence that had recently happened in East Houston. It was this last weekend. Um, what was interesting about this story was that the couple that was involved in the murder suicide had been in a intimate partner relationship for over 5 years, and they had lived in this apartment together. And the police had been called out multiple times for family violence. So one thing that I do is, family law, divorces, custody, and domestic violence. But I want to talk this morning about the warning signs of intimate partner violence. Maybe if we had been a little bit more knowledge or more people had known the the 12 warning signs of intimate partner violence, and maybe this incident would never have happened, and we could have intervened earlier to save the victim. So what I want to do is I want to talk about just briefly what happened. The victim was She was trying to move out of the apartment. She had been putting everything in her boxes when the aggressor pointed his gun at her, killed her, and then killed himself. So it was a murder suicide. And after multiple uh, family violence calls from the police over a period of time. So what do we think led up to this, and what do we think the warning signs could have been to try to prevent this in the future? Okay, so before I talk about intimate partner violence and what it is, I want to talk a broader term. I want to talk about domestic abuse. What is domestic abuse, and why does intimate partner violence? Why is that a subcategory of domestic abuse? Okay, domestic abuse, it can be anything between physical aggression to psychological abuse to threats, possibly to sexual violence. Now, within domestic abuse, you don't always have a household requirement, meaning the victim and the aggressor do not necessarily have to be members of the same household, but typically there has to be like a relationship between the parties, some type of relationship. Um, now, remember, domestic abuse is a very broad category, and I'm going to drill down to intimate partner violence, but I have to get through a few other terms first. Next term is domestic violence. Domestic violence, it can be anything from psychological to physical aggression. Typically, the aggressor and the victim are members of the same household. But what about when there's violence, but they're not members of the same household? That would fall under dating violence. But what about maybe couples who want to, they're not married, but they want to wait until marriage to have sex, so they never really romantic partners. Well, the interesting thing about dating violence is there's no intimacy requirement, but so we have, and there's no household requirement. So on the dating side, there's no intimacy requirement, no household requirement. They're just in a relationship. And then on the other end of the spectrum is the domestic violence, where it's members of the same household. Okay, so what about the gap filler in between? Well, that would be intimate partner violence. Not necessarily a household requirement, but they are in a romantic relationship. So, what is intimate partner violence, and why did I classify this story under IPV, intimate partner violence? Okay, first of all, intimate partner violence is violence, aggression, or manipulation between romantic partners. And that can be anywhere from sexual or physical abuse all the way to psychological abuse. Okay, so what are the warning signs of IPV, intimate partner violence? The first one I want to talk about would be isolation. Isolation is when the aggressor prevents the abused from having relationships with people outside of the abuser's realm. Examples would be controlling who the victim interacts with, who the victim talks to, having any relationship with their own family, their own siblings, their own parents, their own friends, always questioning why are they talking to this person. I think jealousy is a part of it, and maybe the aggressor has their own trust issues. I think the most common example that we see in this information age would be the cell phone. Maybe the aggressor would want to constantly monitor the cell phone use. Why are they texting this person? Why did this person call you? Why did you call your sister? You know, your sister is blah, blah, blah. She is a so and so. She does this. Why do you want to have a relationship with that? Why are you calling your dad? Your dad hates me. Um, you know, not letting them have a relationship outside of the relationship with the abuser. That would be isolation. That's the first big warning sign. Um, Next one I want to talk about is blame. Somehow everything is always your fault, no matter what happens. The abuser had to drop out of school. The abuser wasn't successful at work. The abuser got fired. The abuser got a DWI. Uh, the abuser never got their certificate, never got their degree, or just petty things like the milk is expired. I mean, and somehow it's always your fault, even though that's not what, like maybe the grocery shopping is not something you normally do. There's a zillion and one ways, zillion and one things that you can blame somebody for and make them try to get them to believe it is their fault. But if it's always if it's always your fault for everything, and that always seems to be the common denominator, then maybe it's not actually your fault. You're just in an abusive relationship, and if you with your intimate partner, and if you always have to, or you're not really allowed to defend yourself because all it's going to do is trigger them and make them angry at you, then yeah, you might be you might be a victim of psychological abuse, of emotional abuse in an intimate partner situation. So that's blame. Blame is the other big warning sign. So if you see this um, in your own relationship or relationship of others, maybe it's time to intervene. I don't know. Okay, next is unexplained injuries. Examples might be cuts, scrapes, bruises, and at various multiple stages of healing, meaning they are being re-injured regularly while the old injuries are healing. They're getting new injuries simultaneously. These are things medical professionals are pretty good at spotting and hopefully intervening if they're able to. More obvious signs would be trauma to the face, like bruises, cuts, scrapes. Others might be defensive wounds, like wounds on the forearms, the palms of the hands, um, the feet, I guess the fists, depending on what type of defensive, what happened that caused it to be a defensive wound. Um, okay, next I want to talk about is substance abuse. Now, substance abuse is actually a very big category, and I could easily talk 20, 30 minutes. I actually released a video about a week ago called the 9 symptoms of addiction, or the 9 common addictions, where I go into in-depth detail on substance abuse and how the brain works and why the brain needs once somebody becomes addicted, what happens to the brain, what changes inside the brain that causes them to always need this. But for brevity, I'm going to narrow it down to drugs and alcohol. If you're in an abusive relationship, whether you are the abuser or the victim, and alcohol is a factor, then you don't need alcohol. Don't tell me you're able to control it or whatever. If you're in an abusive relationship and they're always arguing, always fighting, you need to get rid of that stuff. Just get rid of it. It's just all it's going to do is cause problems. Same with drugs. Anybody can go to a doctor and get legally prescribed opioids or all kinds of amphetamines. You just tell the doctor you have concentration problems or you're in pain, whatever. Yeah, you can legally get these things, but that doesn't mean you should. And the problem is, well, you can also get drugs illegally too. Most common ones would be like methamphetamines, cocaine, heroin, things like that. Whether it's the legal ones I described or the illegal ones I described or even the alcohol, the problem is all of these drugs and alcohol that I mentioned affect the body's ability to regulate dopamine levels in a healthy way. And sometimes once you become dependent on these things, that's the only way the brain can release the dopamine. And if you don't have that, then you might spiral into a depression, which causes the abuser to act out in other ways. And when people are in depression, they can become physically aggressive. It's just not feeling sad. They can just become very argumentative and physically abusive. So drugs, alcohol are the ones I want to talk about for purposes of this video. If you want to go into more in-depth detail about other types of addiction, then check out my other video called the 9 Common Types of Addiction. It's on my timeline. Okay, that's substance abuse. Next warning sign is threats. They threaten to hurt you. They threaten to hurt themselves, hurt your family members, threaten to do this or that, make sure you never see the kids again. They're just being angry, toxic, and vindictive. This happens a lot. Threats are a way to control people. Maybe they can threaten to take all kinds of legal action if you don't do this or that, or you threaten to get out of an abusive relationship. Unfortunately, threats are an effective way to keep people in a bad relationship, but that's not the reason someone should stay in an abusive relationship, especially with intimate partners. I guess if there's intimate partners, they're cohabitating, there's no lease, there's no marriage, so there's really no community property. Yeah, I guess one threat is you could always just threaten to kick him out of the apartment or just get up and leave, like what happened this last Saturday in Houston that turned into a murder-suicide. The lady was trying to get out of a bad relationship, and it turned deadly. So, yeah, threats. Okay, next is I want to talk about anxiety, depression, and PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Anxiety is defined as fear, the feeling of fear. It could be chronic, something that just doesn't go away. It's like high blood pressure. There's no cure for it. You can all you can do is treat it. Sometimes people have anxiety after being exposed to trauma. An example of trauma would be being in an abusive relationship. Next one is depression. So, what causes depression? Well, uh, depression is sadness. Depression is not feeling happy. Maybe one reason you're not feeling happy is you're not getting that dopamine release because you're struggling with addictions. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons you can feel depressed. I mean, maybe somebody close to you dies and you feel sad. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons. But yeah, I mean, that is a warning sign. It may be the victim of abuse is feeling sad and they're depressed because they're in an abusive relationship, or maybe the abuser is depressed and the only way they can cope is through acting out and to their intimate partner. Um, Post traumatic stress disorder. Um, Post traumatic stress disorder is someone's inability to cope with stress in a healthy way following a traumatic stressor, some event that happened that made them feel that traumatized them in such a way where they don't not able to deal with stressful situations. Maybe they ruminate, think about the stressful event, uh, have certain avoidance behaviors. They have to avoid a stressful situation. Maybe someone's been in and out of abusive relationships and then go into a new relationship, and that new abuser is starting to abuse alcohol. They react wildly because that's a trigger for them. They've been through so much PTSD, through so much trauma. It's hard to have new relationships. Um, that would be avoidance. Another one would be hypervigilance. Hypervigilance might overlap into jealousy. Maybe the abuser themselves was uh, cheated on, and it was traumatic for them, and they're not able to cope with that in a healthy way. So they're just suspicious of others, suspicious of the victim, possibly think they're always cheating or talking to other women or men, whatever. But also the victim, if the victim is been traumatized and has their own PTSD from being in an abusive relationship, they themselves are hypervigilant. They always uh, think that something's going to happen next, and they can't lead a normal life. So PTSD. Well, sometimes people with PTSD, anxiety, depression, makes them feel like they're in a hopeless situation, and that feeds into the sadness, into the fear, to the avoidance behaviors. Um, so that's something to look out for in intimate partner violence. Now, next thing I want to talk about is sexual control. I guess one way, depending on the dynamics of the relationship, I guess withholding sex, but I don't really consider that really abusive. But to not have sex, but to sexually control somebody, that would be major. Forcing them to have sex, maybe the abuser and the victim were in a major argument, and the abuser feels that they need to feel close again, and maybe having sex would help the two to feel close again. So they force themselves upon the other person, and what they thought was a way to control them, which is a way to control them, actually became a sexual assault, and that's rape, and that's illegal. That's is one of the warning signs that someone might be in a IPV situation. Okay, so next is self-esteem. I want to talk about low self-esteem as a marker for someone who may or may not be in an um, victim of intimate partner violence. They're always being gaslighted by the abuser, always being questioned. The abuser's always playing mind games with them, making them um, question their own reality, uh, convincing convincing the victim that they cannot do better and they cannot function without their batterer. Um, it's the low self-esteem, feeling bad about yourself. Um, I can't remember the name of the author, but there's a good book called "The Body Keeps the Score." It's about how trauma isn't um, limited to just the psychoses or the brain. It actually expresses itself in other ways. If somebody's uh, possibly looks very unhealthy, um, they let themselves become unhealthy. It's possible maybe their mind has become detached from their body and maybe they just don't care anymore because they've been through so much trauma. And that's why they say the body keeps the score. So you don't just look at their mind or what they're telling you. Look at the person globally. Look at them as a person. It'll tell you a lot more. It'll tell you a story about the person. So look at the person from a global perspective, not just at what they're telling you happened. Um, Financial control. This is a big one. Maybe the abuser always makes all the financial decisions for the victim and themselves without letting them having any input. Maybe depending on whether the victim has a job or not, or has their own source of income, giving them an allowance and creating a dependency. Um, Another way to make someone financially dependent on you is to force them to quit their job, uh, force them to drop out of school, just stay home. A great way to make someone financially dependent on you and possibly turn into a victim. Okay, more obvious um, warning sign of intimate partner violence would be anger, um, jealousy behaviors, always thinking that the victim is out there talking to other women or men, thinking they're always cheating, always suspicious, having rapid mood changes. Anything will set them off. The victim has to tiptoe around the abuser's emotions because all it's going to do is trigger them. They're not allowed to defend themselves from accusations. Um, they have to ask for permission to avoid anger episodes from the abuser. And even if they go down a path after asking for permission, they still, of course, did it wrong and they still get in trouble anyways, and they're on the receiving end of the anger episodes. So it's just never a fair situation for the victim. And honestly, they need to get out of it. Okay, next one is, and I unfortunately I see this more often than I'd like. The abuser will threaten self-harm, suicidal ideations, threaten suicide, not just threatening to hurt the other person or their family, but hurt themselves. Now, unfortunately, some victims think that's why they need to stay in a bad relationship so the abuser doesn't hurt themselves. Well, it's unfortunate if the abuser hurts himself, but that's not a staying in a bad relationship to stop that is not a reason to stay in that relationship because you're just getting pulled into their little cobweb of narcissism, and it's a dangerous place to be. Refusing to get out of a bad relationship because they will hurt themselves. It's not fair to anybody, and it forces the victim to stay a victim. There's never going to be any freedom. My only advice is, well, to find a path out of that situation, and it's up to the abuser to go get the help they need. But if they refuse to and they end up hurting themselves, well, I'm sorry, but that's unfortunate, but definitely not a reason to be in a bad abusive relationship. So, next one is touching. Physical aggression. It's never okay for the abuser to hit, slap, punch, shove you, and somehow try to make you think it's okay. I know when it comes to intimate partner violence, it's not just men hitting women. Women hit men too. I see it. It's mostly men hitting women, but women hitting men happens too. And just because a lady is 100 pounds and the man is like 200 pounds, that's not an excuse for a woman to batter her husband. It's just not. And physical violence is definitely probably the strongest marker, the strongest warning sign that someone's in an abusive relationship. Now, just because someone's in a physically abusive relationship, don't think that automatically a protective order is going to get granted by a judge. The judge has to look at the facts and decide if decide if there's going to be a court finding that physical violence has happened, and if there's a threat of it, a likelihood of it happening again in the future. Um, so maybe if family violence did happen in the past, but at the moment it happened, the abuser got on an airplane and flew 1,000 miles away, then and never coming back, then it would be hard to argue that there's a likelihood of it happening again in the future. So that would be a reason for the judge to possibly deny the protective order. But then again, I mean, stranger things have happened. It's really what the judge believes based on the weight of the evidence. So um, I hope this video helps. I'm a family law attorney. I handle a lot of domestic violence cases, and this recent murder-suicide in East Houston really concerned me, and I feel that if we could get um, more awareness of what the warning signs are, then maybe things like this could be prevented. Thank you for spending time with me, and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.